Finally, a winner. Now what? Plus, as he prepares to head out the door, what's left on the mayor's bucket list? Same-sex bathrooms back in the headlines and saying goodbye to one of Kansas City's most iconic brands.
Week in Review is made possible through the generous support of Dave and Jamie Cummings, Bob and Marlise Gorley, Smithfield Foods, Haas and Wilkerson Insurance, the Courtney S. Turner Charitable Trust, John H. Mize and Bank of America N.A. co-trustees, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Nick Haynes. It's been a week of high drama and intrigue, and if you're still puzzled and confused about what on earth happened, this is your show, connecting the dots on our Metro's most important stories. Stephen Dial, who's been tirelessly trekking between here and Topeka all week long for 41 Action News. He's been joined in covering all of the twists and turns in the Kansas governor's race by Caroline Sweeney of KCTV 5 News. Also with us, Mr. Up-to-Date from KCUR-FM, star writer Steve Kraske, and Fox 4 political analyst and Kansas City Star columnist and editorial writer Dave Helling. Alrighty, it took a full week to do it, but now we know the winner in one of our area's most contentious election races. Chris Kobach is the Republican nominee for Kansas governor, and by the slimmest of margins.
Oh, this last week has been, it's been a slow-motion roller coaster is what it's been.
This election is probably the closest in America, but the numbers are just not there unless we would go to extraordinary measures.
That's incumbent Governor Jeff Collier, disappointed but promising to support Kobach in the fall as he takes on Democrat Laura Kelly, a state senator from Topeka.
It's absolutely essential that we march together. Whenever Republicans in Kansas are separated, Republicans in Kansas lose.
I've just had a conversation with the Secretary of State, and I congratulated him on his success, and I repeated my determination to keep this seat in Republican hands.
So with so few votes separating the two candidates, why did Governor Jeff Collier concede with what seemed like, Stephen Dial, remarkably little fight?
Oh, yeah. A lot of people thought we were going to talk about that word recount, and it didn't happen. And people in both campaigns, close to both campaigns, told me the call from the governor to Kobach happened a lot quicker after that Johnson County result released than a lot of us thought it would.
Caroline.
I was speaking to a UMKC political science professor the other day, and he said this was just down to the math. Although 345 votes, 300 votes sounds like a small margin, when you're looking at a primary election, when you have to go back through all of those ballots, it's just not going to add up for the governor. You know, we heard Jeff Collier, the governor, saying that he's going to support Chris Kobach. It's one thing to say that. It's another thing to actually see evidence of that happening. Are we seeing evidence of that happening this week,
I think,
Steve?
sure, two things. He appeared yesterday with the Secretary of State in a show of unity, which is significant. And I think also, Nick, the fact that he conceded as quickly as he did, as Stephen points out, without the long recount, which would have taken weeks, a very gracious gesture from one party member to another to avoid a long, protracted fight here that would have really advantaged the Democrats even more so than they've already seen an edge given the tumult we've seen so far.
What's been the biggest lesson from this whole week in this Kansas governor's race, Dave?
Well, several lessons. The most important is the way we vote in this country is still a mess. And counting ballots is a mess, and they do it one way in Johnson County, another way in Sedgwick County. Legislators are already talking, Nick, about addressing some of these discrepancies that popped up anytime you have a close election. We suddenly take a look at how people cast ballots and realize it isn't as perfect or as understandable as we think it is. So that's an important lesson. I think what Steve said about, and what everyone has said about Jeff Collier, is very important as we head into the general. Where do the Collier votes go? Who gets those votes? Were those anti-Kobach votes that are available to Greg Orman or Laura Kelly? Or were they Republican votes that will naturally fall in line for Chris Kobach? That's the central mystery of the next 8 to 10 weeks as we head into election.
You mentioned, first of all, then, this whole nightmare about the actual counting of votes. And there was one situation, I saw it in your report, Stephen, about one ballot because somebody had died, that somehow then that was tossed aside because the voter died before Election Day. How did, some of our viewers want to know, how did the election commissioner even know that? Did they check the obituary page to find out who died and who
I asked
hasn't?
him. He said, believe it or not, a lot of families do contact the election office to let them know so that there won't be voter fraud. He didn't speak specific to this person who died. We just know that they voted early, they died, and he says the system constantly updates too so they can check if someone is still living or not.
We're getting lots of questions. Susan asks, are people who voted but whose votes don't get counted for whatever reason, are they notified that their votes were tossed out?
Well, I talked to the elections office, and they told me definitely not this week, but you can call if you had a provisional or a mail-in ballot and call and say, hey, I'm checking to see if my vote counted. They told me that process is in place. You can call, but I don't know anyone who's done that.
Well, I've actually been out on the street talking with people because the validity of these votes is a real big concern for people in Kansas City after the debacle we've seen over the votes counts and then the provisional ballots. People want to know if their votes have been counted, so I would expect the Johnson County Elections Office to get ready for their phone to ring off the hook.
Now, I always love reading the comments from readers and viewers to stories. This one I thought was particularly worth mentioning. This is from Dave, who writes, Collier seems like a nice guy, but he's too drab for today's politics reality show. Is there a nugget of truth to that?
Well, given the fact that he lost against someone who is a reality show star in a sense, Chris Kobach, you can make that case. Having said that, Nick, let's not underplay for a moment just what a successful few months Jeff Collier had. He was the huge underdog heading into this primary campaign a few months ago, had to navigate the governor's office, the transition from Sam Brownback, distance himself from Brownback and handle a very tough school finance package before the legislature, and still he came within a couple hundred, 300 votes of pulling this election
Could he
off.
have done something differently that would have changed the outcome, Dave?
Well, I'm sure he is now sitting in a room somewhere going, gosh, 200 votes to flip, that's about 2 votes per county in Kansas. Had he been able to flip those votes, he'd be the nominee for governor. So at that point, everything's up for grabs. He did not come to the Star's editorial board. And
that was the difference.
No, but this is an important thing
Okay.
to think about. And so for that reason, we didn't consider him for an endorsement. In a race where he loses or wins by 10,000 votes, who cares? 200 votes, it might have made a difference. So there are all kinds of things that the governor, I'm sure, is thinking about now in terms of what he needs to do. Let me just point out one quick thing. Chris Kobach got 40% of the Republican vote. That means 3 out of 5 Republicans wanted someone else at the top of the state's ticket. Chris Kobach has work to do, too, and he's got to convince those people, a majority of those voters, to come back to his side.
We have the impression, or this is now between Laura Kelly and Chris Kobach, but there is a third person in this, and that's Greg Orman, the independent candidate. But there seems to be conflicting analysis about the role Greg Orman will play in this race. Firstly, is it certain he will be on the ballot this fall, Steve?
Well, not dead set certain yet. The Secretary of State's office has to verify the signatures he's turned in to get himself on the ballot. We don't expect that to be a problem. He turned in twice as many as he needs, but we'll have an answer to that pretty shortly, I think.
There seems to be confusion also about who he actually benefits and who he actually detracts from. Does he benefit Laura Kelly or does he benefit Chris Kobach, Caroline?
I think we're going to have to watch the moderates. Those are going to be the canary in the coal mine for both sides, not just moderate Republicans who might not have an affinity for Chris Kobach, but I'm talking moderate Democrats too. You've seen that kind of shakeup in the Kansas legislature already. We have some moderate Republicans that have been supporting Democrats on the state level, and we're hearing some backlash from Susan Weigel's office.
And it's not just going to be Greg Orman. We also have a Libertarian Party candidate in this race, and I actually counted it maybe as many as 4 independent candidates. So there'll be lots of people in this election, Stephen.
From talking to Chris Kobach the day after he became the nominee, he's taking it very serious that he's going against 2 candidates in his mind, Orman and Kelly, and he thinks that, Orman can pull that moderate vote from him or people that would be voting for Kelly. And he said that he doesn't think that Republicans will just say, bump Kobach. He thinks that they are to the left of him, way to the left of him, and he thinks that it won't hurt him, but it's on his radar.
Steve.
Nick, this is an extraordinary moment. Modern Kansas political history hasn't seen a 3-way race for Kansas governor before, and trying to handicap exactly how this is going to shake out, the bets are really all over the board. Orman, of course, ran for the U.S. Senate in 2014, finished with 40% plus of the vote, but the predictions for where he's going to go this time range from 10% to 40%, that he could actually win this race to he'll be a spoiler in the race at the end.
I think all my colleagues, Nick, are right about watching what happens to Greg Orman. He's at 12, 13% now, may shrink to 6 or 7, or he may go to 18 or 19 as the campaign unfolds. But I want to talk a little bit about Chris Kobach briefly. He won the nomination with about 41% of the vote, as we noted. It's possible he could be elected with less than 50% of the vote. That would mean that he would win less than a majority in his own party and less than a majority from the people of Kansas. That could be a political problem for him going forward if indeed he's the victor in November.
Could the next election night debacle happen in the race for Missouri's U.S. Senate seat? A new poll out this week shows incumbent Democrat Claire McCaskill in a statistical dead heat against Josh Hawley, the Republican state attorney general. Both are locked at 47% of the vote each, with very few Missourians undecided. This week, both candidates challenge each other to a slew of debates all across the state, though a Kansas City Star editorial claims that that's unlikely to happen, pointing out that there was only one debate between Missouri U.S. Senator Roy Blunt and his challenger 2 years ago, and consultants plead with their candidates to say less, not more. But does anyone really care about debates anymore, and do they really change anyone's mind, Caroline?
I think we just need to look at the 2016 election to see what kind of impact debates can have. Now, Hillary Clinton and President Donald Trump did have 3 debates, but you could see a swing in where the voters' minds were going when polls were taken after each of those debates. So although Josh Hawley wants these no rules, no moderators, just pure debates, I think something to give the voters an idea of what each person is thinking to maybe rise above the kind of fray and noise would be really important.
Does it really change anybody's minds, though, Stephen?
I mean, you're going to have that group that's going to vote blue, that's going to vote red, but both candidates are really trying to get the people in the middle. In debates, you know, we have gaffes, we have people who say things that they now regret, and that will swing a vote, especially in a close race.
I wrote a story about this 2 years ago because consultants now almost universally are telling candidates don't debate. And for the reasons that Steve suggests, which is if you do well, you're just going to solidify your own support. You may get a few sort of undecideds, but basically you're not going to improve your standing. But if you make a mistake, if you say something wrong, if there's a gaffe, if you, get into a territory that you don't want to get into, the only thing that can happen is that you'll lose votes. And so consultants are telling candidates in both parties better to stay away.
Debates are certainly a way for the public to learn more about candidates. If there were debates, would we have learned more about the winner of the Republican House primary in Missouri, who is now being condemned by his own party for anti-Semitic and racist remarks? Radio host Steve West won the GOP primary for a House seat in Clay County, but since then he's come under fire for past statements, including Hitler was right and a Jewish cabal is destroying America.
Now they're going to say that I'm a Nazi. I'm not a Nazi. I don't believe in racial supremacy. I don't believe in anything that Hitler did.
Now, he won by nearly 25 points, though I'm assuming most people weren't aware of his web postings and radio comments when they headed to the polls, Steve.
I think that's probably a safe assumption, Nick. This one slipped under the radar screen, sort of so many other big important races flying around. I think voters in that district were surprised by this, and I suspect he's not going to go real far in terms of a future political career.
The end is in sight for outgoing Kansas City Mayor Sly James. This week he announces his bucket list for the last 12 months of his 8-year tenure. On the list is passage of a sales tax hike to expand pre-K care, an initiative to somehow or another achieve racial equity, and an effort to control rising pension costs. It's interesting the word solving the crime problem in Kansas City wasn't explicitly mentioned on the bucket list, but is that because Mayor James believes expanding pre-K and achieving racial equity will put a dent in violence, or that he simply doesn't think that's something he can solve in the last few months of his term, Stephen?
From talking to the mayor, he said multiple times that crime is connected to people's upbringing, to their background, and a lot of things have been put in place with the police department, and he's basically saying to voters and to people living here, we're doing all that we can, but it takes what happens at home, and he thinks pre-K education, getting that grounding, will change that.
Well, we just learned within the last half an hour that the mayor is going to stop pushing for this November date and actually slide that into April. So
this is for the pre-K tax,
yes,
right?
This will be for that pre-K tax. So even though it's an initiative of his that he wants to get done, there's a high likelihood it's not going to happen until his tenure's over.
Dave.
I think what the mayor is learning is that the final year of a Kansas City mayor is difficult because his or her ability to sort of push an agenda comes up against the ambition of other council members who are running for his office or her office, and the cross currents as everyone realizes the mayor doesn't have the power or won't soon have the power that he once had. And so things like pre-K become much more difficult. It's just, you know, council members are saying, I'm not afraid of you. I'm not going to vote yes. And he has to make some new decisions.
You know, there's no question here, Nick, that the mayor rushed this proposal, didn't build the kind of support on the council or among the school superintendents that he needs to push this idea forward. He made the same mistake with the airport, you know, a year ago, and that was very costly in terms of his agenda. That said, let's just point out that we all clamor for our politicians to spend political capital, use their popularity to advance causes right up to the end of their terms. The mayor deserves some credit for doing that, even though he has misstepped once again.
What about the pension costs part of this equation? It seems interesting. Doesn't seem like a seductive legacy building component for a mayor. Probably perhaps even win him more enemies than friends as he tries to leave office.
Well, pensions are a knotty problem for K-N-O-T-T-Y, by the way, problem for governments all over the country. Kansas City, I haven't checked recently, but I think Kansas City spends around $80–90 million a year in pension payments alone. That's about a third of the entire earnings tax just to fund the pension, which, by the way, is underfunded. So the mayor, if he's going to expend political capital, as Steve suggests, this would be a huge place to do it because it isn't popular, it isn't easy, it isn't sexy in the sense that you'll be on the front page of the newspaper, but it's an extraordinarily important problem in Kansas City, and sooner or later, elected officials are going to have to deal with it.
Does the mayor's racial equity part of his bucket list also include naming a significant part of a Kansas City place or institution after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? I noticed that's also now may not be on the ballot in November, the renaming of the Paseo.
It doesn't look like it's going to be on the ballot this November. In fact, you know, the black ministers in town really were pushing this a few months ago. That push is sort of fallen on rough times here. There's now talk about doing it in April, but the city council, Nick, could take up that mantle and do something in the short term if it chooses to.
Stephen.
I've been talking to people in the community, and being from Atlanta where Dr. King has a significant footprint, you know, people here are saying, why rename a street that's already established? Or, you know, when they heard the airport and they tried to explain it's the terminal building, not the airport. I think some in the community, even in the black community, think this is kind of too little too late. What straws are you grasping at? So that's a big conversation that I think council and everyone needs to have.
It's back to school this week for most children in the metro. And what's the top issue facing schools as your kids return to class? Is it teacher shortages, concern over test scores, building security?
Local headlines about back to school may not be our best guide, but in Kansas, suicide among our school kids seems to be the top issue making the news. And in Missouri, it's bathrooms.
The locking stalls have walls and doors that run from the ceiling to the floor.
There isn't that chance of someone peering above or underneath like there could be in traditional restrooms.
North Kansas City schools abandoning boys and girls restrooms and bringing in gender-neutral washrooms at its 2 new elementary schools and at its largest high school. That story being picked up by news outlets across the country.
As far as the privacy goes, I'm not remotely concerned.
I don't really see a downside to it.
In none of the news accounts could I find anyone interviewed who disagreed with the policy, even though a Gallup poll finds that Americans are still split on the question. Are there still critics of allowing both genders to use the same bathroom? Is it even an issue in any candidate campaign on either side of our state line? Caroline?
Well, if you want to look for critics, just look in the comment sections of any of the stories that we've written about this.
Yes.
Even though the school district isn't addressing the transgender issue as a reason for these gender neutral bathrooms, people still turn to that as a reason for why they don't want them. However, I also hear people who say things like, well, we have a gender neutral bathroom in my house and there's no issue. I think the most important thing is that they've secured them like they have and they've built the walls the way that they have.
You know, we're hearing a lot from our viewers about this question too. Anne writes to us and says, why is it that schools are put in the uncomfortable position of leading the charge on this issue? Do our city halls provide gender neutral bathrooms? Will the new KCI airport feature same-sex washrooms? Well, new design renderings for KCI were released this week. Are gender neutral bathrooms part of that picture?
I don't think so. I mean, I watched yesterday.
Yeah, they're doubling the number of restrooms,
they are,
but no gender-neutral bathrooms.
But it may be just happenstance that this school district, because it's building a new facility, has to confront this issue, which will confront public bodies all over the city and the country, really, as this becomes more of a trend, Nick. You know, it's amazing how we argue about stuff like this, about where people go to the bathroom when we have, you know, a murder rate that's through the ceiling and problems with education. To spend a lot of time arguing about where we go to the bathroom seems counterproductive.
Well, on the Kansas side, the spotlight this back-to-school week is on suicide.
I would say that not only is there an epidemic that's going on of teen suicide, I would say it's bordering on really a pandemic throughout the country.
One is too many. And so as we take a look at the numbers, we know that it's important for us to open up this conversation.
In Johnson County, 6 major school superintendents coming together to fight what they now say is a teen suicide epidemic. Teen suicides in Johnson County nearly doubling in the first 6 months of this year. The superintendents announcing enough is enough. I wasn't sure, though, when I read this story, what they're actually doing differently to fix the problem, Steve.
You know, let's be clear, Nick. Superintendents will struggle to solve this problem. Parents who deal with kids who are suicidal struggle to deal with this problem. Having said that, you know, you have to applaud them for raising awareness here, raising sensitivities, meeting about this, and making sure that staff and teachers and principals are looking for possible problem students who might be suffering from severe depression, and a little attention, little intervention might help. But there's no magic bullet here, and no one should walk away from this conversation thinking anything else.
And given all of the concerns that schools deal with today, I mean, can they really solve the suicide issue?
I don't think they're looking at solving anything. I think they're looking at providing resources and spaces and heading up discussion for students, parents, and guardians who need these things. Telling our schools they need to solve a problem, or thinking our schools districts can solve an issue that takes not only schools and parents to solve it together, I think is a high expectation.
Well, we mentioned these 2 headline-grabbing stories, of course, suicide in Kansas and the same-sex bathrooms in Missouri. Education is still a major issue in the race of governor, for instance, in Kansas, and that's still a dividing point between the candidates there, Stephen.
Oh, yeah, definitely. When I talked to Chris Kobach, he now says that he wants 75 cents on every education dollar to be spent in the classroom. He took a shot at the Shawnee Mission School District, saying that they have a crystal palace. Their school districts are putting money into big administrative buildings and administrative salaries, and he thinks that it should be in the classroom.
To be clear, Chris Kobach has said he would not have signed that school finance bill that came through the legislature this spring, possibly setting off a constitutional crisis if the legislature then would not have been in compliance with what the state Supreme Court said. Laura Kelly, the Democrat, is in a very different place. She would have signed that bill, and presumably Greg Orman would have too.
And Chris Kobach's criticism of the Shawnee Mission District and education more broadly is a very interesting campaign strategy, because Johnson County provides the bulk of the votes. 1 out of 5 votes in the entire state comes from Johnson County, and he did poorly there. He lost by about 6 points to Jeff Collier and to Jim Barnett, whose votes one thinks will head toward Laura Kelly. So, you know, an anti-school platform is an interesting choice for nominee Kobach to make as we go forward.
And he told me that he thinks that the Supreme Court is out of its rights to
and he wants a constitutional amendment to get the courts out of schools.
And so another
That's an interesting thing.
A differentiation between him and Laura Kelly, his opponent. And finally, in a city that isn't home to that many national corporate headquarters, it's noteworthy that one of our metro's most iconic names is shutting its doors. Lee Jeans, headquartered in Merriam, Kansas for more than 100 years, is now leaving town for North Carolina. The company has long outsourced its jean making to factories overseas. So does it matter that our city won't play home any longer to this worldwide brand, Caroline?
I think if it were just Lee Jeans, it wouldn't be such an issue. But we're seeing issues at DST and at Harley-Davidson. So if you look at the metro as a whole, losing one more job growing or, employer is just going to keep hitting us back.
Stephen.
And just to piggyback on what she's saying, we still are talking about this T-Mobile Sprint merger. You know, the world headquarters is here. A lot of people are saying all those jobs won't stay here if the deal goes through.
Nick, Lee Jeans has been with us since before 1920. They're part of the fabric of this community. So anytime you
good
lose,
one.
yeah, yes, right. Anytime you lose a franchise player like that, it says something.
But these are about 130 jobs, is what we're talking about. Why were they actually leaving, Dave?
Well, there's been some corporate reorganization, and they're splitting part of the brand and moving some people to North Carolina, others to other places. But you know, Kansas City almost uniquely lacks Fortune 500 companies. I mean, it has a strong, diverse
and does that really
employment
matter,
base.
though?
I think increasingly you will hear from political leaders that it does matter or does concern them because you need a strong corporate presence to push things like city improvements and you know, across state line cooperation, and yet you don't really have that kind of corporate presence that you might have had even 20, 25 years ago. Hallmark is under some pressure. We mentioned Harley, the car companies, Ford and GM. They're struggling a bit too. So I think there is some chatter in Kansas City about being more aggressive to land Fortune 500 company headquarters here. Sprint and T-Mobile being one thing that they're worried about, and because they do think it is important in our community.
And before we leave you, if you've lived in this town a while, you'll certainly recognize this man. Craig Glazer, king of the Kansas City comedy houses, has died. Glazer, who was one of the city's most outspoken personalities, was in his mid-60s and had been battling several health issues, including leukemia. He was comedy promoter at the Stanford's Comedy Club downtown, the latest stint in a career spent owning or managing comedy houses in Westport, the Legends, and in Johnson County. In a community that doesn't have so many instantaneously recognizable celebrities or personalities, Steve, this is a loss.
Yes, and one of his friends described him as going through his life as if his hair was on fire, and anybody who knew Craig knew that's exactly what he was.
And that is our Week in Review. Our thanks to our news reviewers, keeping you up to date weekdays at 11 on KCUR-FM, Steve Kraske, and from the streets to the State House, 41 Action News reporter Stephen Dial, from across town at KCTV5 News, Caroline Sweeney, and from the pages of your Kansas City Star, Dave Helling. I'm Nick Haynes. No show next week as we bring you our summer membership drive. Will you make a date to join us 2 weeks from now? From all of us at KCPT, thanks for spending part of your weekend with us.